Hi everyone, in today's video, I'm going to share some of the best techniques I use to create this tabby cat with a focus on beginners techniques and information. I'll add tons of delicious extra tips as we go so you can learn the basics of building a painting from start to finish. And these tips are intended for those of you who want to paint realistically but get a soft, dreamy look. Hi everyone, welcome back to Rachel's Studio. I'm Rachel Varner. I explain not just the hows but the whys to help you move along your painting journey faster. And today I want to talk to you about 3 techniques, but also give you a lot more information. So let's start at the very beginning of this painting. If you want to paint a realistic cat and your drawing skills aren't great and you don't want to spend a lot of time drawing, use a line drawing. Use a tracing. If you would like this line drawing, I'll put it on my website for a limited time at www.rachelstudio.com/line drawing. And I do recommend you subscribe to this channel so you don't miss upcoming videos where I offer something for a limited time, perhaps a week, so you don't miss future line drawings or other offerings. Speaking of free offerings, if you'd like to try one of my start to finish tutorials for free, go to rachelstudio.com beginner bunny. You'll need to join as a member, but I promise not to spam you. Also, be sure to come share your paintings for critiques or just to share on my free Facebook group. And I'll put that link right here. And remember, if you want to watch this tutorial from start to finish with commentary as I go, it will be on my Patreon and available for individual purchase on my website. When you join my Patreon, you get access to not just one, but over 100 tutorials. And I would say watch Beginner Bunny first, which I have linked for free below in the description, and see if you like my teaching style. It's not for everyone because especially for beginners, painting with a lot of wet and wet techniques in a dreamy style is more of an advanced approach. I do have several beginner-oriented tutorials though, if you're determined like I was to paint dreamy from the very start of my artistic journey. So if you're stubborn, you might enjoy painting with me if you want wet and wet, dreamy looking, realistic animals. So here is how I transfer my line drawing. I print it out, put it on the window, put my paper over it. Here I'm using cold press, Fabriano Artistico, and I use a number 2 pencil because softer pencils will create mud when you get them wet. And remember to lighten your line drawing with a kneaded eraser if you want to before you get your paper wet, because after your paper is wet, it will set your pencil lines. So next, to stretch or not to stretch. I never have stretched my watercolor paper. I just tape my paper down and paint. Yes, it will buckle. Some paper is more than others, but as it dries, it will flatten back out. And you can even flatten it more by dampening the back and putting it under a heavy book overnight, which I've never done, by the way. It really doesn't bother me. If you're a super beginner and maybe not ready to commit to watercolor, I would suggest getting a few tubes of paint and a few brushes. I will refer you to a video about the paint colors I love, and there's just 10 of them. And when you click on the link, it will cue it up for you and not take you out of this video. And I also recommend just 3 brushes if you're just starting out. An 8 round, a 2 round, and a mop or a 3/4 oval like I use. And silver black velvets are my favorite go-to brushes, and I've linked all my favorite supplies, by the way, down in the description. I do 90% of my paintings with those brushes. Okay, so see how I've given you a ton of extra tips and we're not even on technique 1 yet. So here's technique 1, the underpainting. I almost always start with a very wet, large underpainting covering much of the painting with wet tea consistency paint. Tea consistency paint being very watery paint where I've mixed a lot of water into a little bit of paint. And so you're basically tinting your paper with the underlying color. I knew I wanted to use purple as my color of choice for the background to vibrate with the yellows because purple and yellow are complementary, so they complement each other and make each other vibrate. I made a whole video about all that, and I'll link that here. And so I put some purple in the background and right into the cat and the delicate shadows where the white fur has shadows. Note, I leave the bright fur perfectly dry at all times because in watercolor, the white of the paper is the white in watercolor painting. Where the cat is lighter on the right of the cat, I put yellow. Where there's lighter fur and where there's darker brown fur, I put burnt sienna on the far left side of the painting where the fur is darker. I even put in the underpainting of the eye with Winsor green gold and let it bleed into the rest of the cat, which later will help make everything hang together better and provide some dreaminess factor. Because you will get the best eye effects that look dreamy and self-blended, I drop in thicker paint while the eye is wet so the colors melt into each other in a natural way. I love that about watercolor, by the way. It does the blending work for you. So that is technique number 2 I want to highlight for my beginners, which is wet and wet, where you mingle colors using wet and wet techniques. So wet and wet just means the paper is wet and your paint is wet. Of course, watercolor is always wet. So dropping different colors next to each other on already wet paper, and your paper is either wet from being painted or pre-wet with clean, clear water, which I do with almost every single painting. So the paper is wet and you drop paint into that wet paper. And that's also called charging, by the way. So when you put different colors next to each other on wet paper, they mingle and blend a little, creating beautiful effects. So while everything is wet, I try to get in as many darker features and details as I can, like those black stripes. If I would have painted those dark black stripes on dry paper, they would have looked stuck on. So I paint a lot of the dark stripes on damp or even more than damp paper. And remember, if your paper is too wet, your stripes will bloom too much. If that happens, blot and try again. If your paper is too dry, you can moisten the edges with a half-wet brush to soften the edges, and I'll show you a little bit about that later in one of the next techniques. You might be beginning to realize a lot of how your marks look depends on 2 main factors: how wet your paper is and how much water you've mixed in with your paint. I made a whole video illustrating all these different combinations, and I'll link that here. So there is one more technique I want to jump to before this video gets too long. So technique number 3 that you hear a lot about is dry on dry, which gives you a bit of a rough texture. So let's fast forward through some of this painting process to where the paper has all dried and I've started building up the painting, which especially for fur like this, you do in layers. Paint a layer, let it dry, repeat. Because watercolor is transparent, you will be able to see some of the previous layers that you painted, kind of like how layers of different colored saran wrap layered over each other would affect each other's colors and darkness. And in the case of watercolor, texture. So you build up complex textures by layering, painting one layer over the other to create texture. So I'm going to show you dry on dry, but with a twist, how I dreamify it, because I paint mostly soft, furry animals, and dry on dry can look really harsh and stuck on and stiff. So here, I paint about milk consistency paint, which is thicker than tea consistency paint, and more watery than cream consistency paint, which you can learn about more in depth. I did 3 videos recently, one on tea, milk, and cream consistency. So be sure to go watch those. But anyway, to paint fur textures dry on dry, remember, paint in the direction of the fur with brush strokes about the length of the fur. And then I add a second step, which is going in with a half-wet brush, touching those strokes here and there to loosen them up, softening and dreamifying their look. Let's look at one more example of this. And now, when I make wet on dry marks like that and they look a little stiff, I'll clean up my brush, get a little half drop on it, squeeze out any excess, and then just kind of go through here and just loosen it up with some water. See how that kind of softens it and makes it look more natural somehow. So that's on dry. So I completely clean out my brush, wipe it on the edge of the jar, maybe give it a gentle squeeze, and then just go back in before this dries real fast and just loosen it up so it doesn't look like a stuck-on brush mark. This corner I'd like really dark, so I'm going to get lamp black, and I'm going to get some of this. Actually, this junk on my palette over here is so perfect. And it's chocolate brown, so this was mixed with burnt sienna and either French ultramarine or lamp black. I don't even know. It doesn't matter. But I'm just going to put some little fur textures in through here. So I'm painting with thick milk consistency, really, just to darken up some of this a little bit more. And see how I'm just adding layer after layer after layer of fur texture on top of each other after the other textures, the other fur layers dry. And you can just do that until you turn blue in the face to get as much detail as you want. I'm gonna get some lamp black. I feel like this edge is not dark enough up against this yellow edge. So I'm using the very tip and trying to really get some thin lines. I'm failing miserably. Miserably. I'm talking like my son. It's probably because I have too much water in my heel. I'm not getting a thin enough line. Let's see if that helps by, do you see what I did? I didn't dot out this, and I dotted out the heel to get the water out. To darken along this edge. But let me show you one more thing. Remember, the whites in your painting are mostly the white of the paper, but what about tiny little white details like whiskers and eye glints? You can either use masking at the very beginning, which is liquid plastic you paint on to protect your paper while you paint, and just go search my YouTube channel for masking and you'll find videos about it. But I also use white gouache at the end. So here I squeeze out a bit of white gouache, being careful to keep it far away from my regular watercolors because white gouache is like chalk, and if it mixes with your paint, it will make them chalky too. I mix in a tiny bit of water so it is workable enough to paint with and use a rigger brush to paint on the whiskers. I could practice on this. You can also use a white gel pen for this if you're not going to use it for anything fancy, but for commissions and competition pieces and collectible work, I try to stay away from gel pens. Now, I may still make little adjustments. I usually do. This needs to be a little lighter, maybe there. Little flecks. I like the flecks that this cat has. Really adds some drama to the eye. See, this is the futzing. I do a lot. I'm getting some permanent green light and just adding a little bit more. Just really subtle though, really watery. In the middle of the eye, just a touch. All right, I could keep going, you know I can, but let's sign it. All right, I'm going to sign with a Micron archival. This one's a size 01, and I usually try to sign away from off the animal if I can. And I have started putting the date on mine again. I stopped on the advice that if a collector sees that you've had a painting for many years and they see that it hasn't sold, maybe that would affect their decision to buy it, but I don't really care about that right now. That's really not where I'm at with what I care about. So I'm more interested in how my painting evolves over time. So that's kind of where I'm at. All right, shall we take the tape off and see what we've got? I wish we had more time. There is so much more amazing things to learn. I'm still learning every day, but let's end it here before our heads explode. Check out my description below to find links to my supplies, other free tutorials, other links you may be interested in. Like this video to show the algorithm other people might like my content too, which helps me grow and bring you more free content. Leave me a comment, which I will answer. Be sure to go binge the rest of my content to learn not just the how, but the why of watercolor painting so you progress faster on your watercolor journey. Now go watercolor your world. Bye, everybody.